Hello and welcome back to another episode of You Want to Do What with Dan and Julie. Today we have Lucy on, who is a naturalist and conservationist. Hi Lucy, how are you?
Hello, I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. So do you want to tell everyone a bit about what you actually do?
Yes, it's a bit of a broad umbrella, so I wear many hats. I am a general naturalist. I describe myself as a nature nerd. I'm just a wildlife lover, and I like to write about it, tell people about it, and communicate about nature, the natural environment, conservation, and why it's important.
So how did you sort of decide to go into this industry?
So I kind of fell into it. One thing I'm really passionate about is that every single human being, I reckon, on the planet has a natural affinity with and attraction to nature. Most people you talk to will say that they love David Attenborough, they like watching a wildlife documentary. Show me anyone who wouldn't want to, swim with dolphins. That's the ultimate dream, isn't it?
Yeah.
Everybody loves some kind of animal or wildlife, and that's because, we've evolved as a species in the natural environment. And when we're all very young and very little, we have this natural affection with wildlife. And unfortunately, in a lot of the modern world, that's been lost. And people in the modern day are less and less connected with our natural environment and nature. I didn't live like that. I had a childhood where I was, always outside, always muddy, always prodding and poking at wildlife and creepy crawlies. And that love never really left me. So all I knew when I was a kid was I want to work with animals. I want to work with animals. And until I was about 6 or 7, I thought I wanted to be a vet because that's the only job I knew of that involved working with animals. And that was until I found out that there were people out there who did this thing called conservation. And that's when it changed my life. And so I've just kind of pursued being close to nature and working with nature for as long as I can remember. And I'm not very practical, so I'm not very good with a spade on a nature reserve. And I'm not very scientific in the sense of don't ever ask me to do stats or anything mathematic, but I can talk about nature, as I'm sure you can tell. And I like to try and inspire people about wildlife and nature and why it's important, and hopefully raise some awareness of the sad state of affairs it's in. So that was a very long story, sorry.
No, it's fine. So obviously in the world at the moment, conservation is one of the most important things we can do for our planet. What is it you do more or less on a day-to-day basis to conserve?
Yes, so in the wider kind of conservation world, a lot of the focus is on climate change, which is rightly so. It's the biggest threat our species has ever faced. But what's not often given the same amount of airtime that's just as important is the biodiversity crisis. And the two things are inextricably interlinked. So the fact that we're facing the 6th mass extinction event in the history of life, and we're causing it as a species, it's pretty scary. And the way that we treat our natural environment is exacerbating and worsening climate change. So deforestation, loss of our peatlands, the way we treat the oceans, it's all interlinked with the climate crisis. And a lot of our action on climate crisis tends to focus on technology and, are we driving electric cars? Are we turning the lights off? Are we recycling? Are we using less plastic? But there's a lot of actions we could take to boost nature and boost biodiversity that will in turn help us with climate change. So letting forests regenerate naturally and using amazing species like beavers as ecosystem engineers. So an animal that you can release that will help manage the landscape and reduce things like flooding. So it will mitigate the effects of flooding on a community. So I advocate, my kind of role, self-described role, is to try and advocate all of these solutions and educate people about it, because your average Joe on the street is so disconnected from nature and wildlife, they don't know what it is. Most people couldn't name 10 species of British bird, for example. I'm talking about most of this in a UK basis, but it's applicable around the world. So, on an individual basis, I have actions that I do to try and, solve the problem. But the whole thing is about all of us as a species changing our behaviour. So as much as I can, buy organic food and not use disposable plastic as much as possible and not fly, it's all about all of us kind of acting together to have that cumulative effect and trying to, change things from the top.
So you mentioned that you've always loved animals and always been very involved in the natural world. Did that translate into sort of school? Did you do subjects like biology? Were you involved with that, with the vision of going into being a vet and into the animal world?
Yes. So when I was younger, which wasn't that long ago, but I'm not that young anymore. There weren't that many kind of natural history opportunities in education. So I studied at GCSE. I studied as my extra kind of options. Geography was like the most naturey thing I could do. And then at A level, I studied biology and geography again. But now they've got all sorts of snazzy things. Like I think there's going to be a natural history GCSE next year in the UK.
Oh, really?
Which is really cool. And at A level now, at certain sixth forms and colleges, you can do environmental science and things like that. So I did go to uni, but I by all means don't think uni is a necessity to work in conservation. So much natural knowledge can be taught by experience, just getting outside and sticking your nose in and teaching yourself.
What is it you studied at university?
Wildlife conservation I studied. So
okay. And did that do you think that helped prepare you for going into help conserve the country?
A little bit. I think no, it did. Obviously, it gave me an education, and I learnt about the science aspect of it. But it doesn't really gear you up for how to teach you, like I said, like the average Joe about what wildlife is. So it was very science led, whereas there's a lot more people-y things that you can do.
So I actually have a question regarding conservation. We hear a lot about conserving habitats and things like that, and the actual animals. We don't hear as much about the plants. And I was actually wondering, what is it? What is happening to considering the conservation of plant life in the country?
Oh, that's an excellent question. This is where you get into kind of factions of natural history, and everybody has wars like birds are better, insects are better, plants are better. But when it comes down to it, what makes a habitat is its plant life, and that plant life is directly related to the geology underneath, so the rocks that you've got, and that will determine what kind of plants can grow in a habitat. So you might have woodland, you might have a short grassland, you might have a really wet, soggy, acidic bog, and those plants will determine what animals come there. So the rarer the habitat, the rarer the animals that are in it. So people tend to go for the sexy megafauna when they're thinking of conservation. They think elephants and lions.
Yeah, exactly.
But, it's those little things you said. So it's plants are the big issue. And we have a really messed up relationship with our plant life in this country. From the stuff that's in our kind of the places we live. So cities and towns, local authorities tend to just mow anything that, first of all, don't get me started on the concept of weeds. There's no such thing as a weed. People hate, in massive inverted commas, weeds, but they're just our native species, and so many insects and other creatures rely on them. Things like thistles. People hate thistles, but one of our most beautiful birds, the goldfinch, that's got a bright red head like it's stuck its face in jam, and it's got bright yellow wings. It looks like a little parrot. They rely on thistles to eat the seeds all throughout winter. So if you cut back thistles, goldfinches have got nothing to eat, and nobody thinks of that. They just think, oh, it's ugly, cut it down.
I think personally, one of the reasons maybe we're not as I don't want to say into, but as aware as conservation in the country is, I've never seen that bird you've just described, or many of the other birds that we have in this country. And we live in the countryside essentially.
Yes.
And still, I haven't, I've never seen that bird.
Exactly, and that's for two reasons. One, I will fight to the death to say that the UK has fantastic, amazing, incredible, sexy, wildlife. But we are one of also the most nature depleted countries in the world. We've gotten rid of a hell of a lot of it. We've got really bad track history of making things extinct in this country. And a lot of our landscape now is managed in a way that's really not good for wildlife. So there's that. And then there's also the fact that we're never educated about it. So unless you've got a figure in your life that teaches you about wildlife, you will have seen goldfinches. I will put all the money I've got on the fact that you will have seen goldfinches, but you'll just never have known, because to you they're a speck in the sky. But if you learn how to recognize something by its song, you can think, oh, a goldfinch. And then if you've got binoculars, you can lift them up and have a look and see that face that I described.
What are we doing to manage the country in the wrong way? You mentioned mowing, I'd imagine the side of roads and things by councils, but can we rewild, and what can we do?
Yes, there's lots. So, we always have to strike a balance between how we use our land. So obviously we need to use it for things like agriculture, for growing food for ourselves, for forestry, for timber, for, sustainable timber. But there's so much land so first of all, we waste a huge amount of food. So we intensively manage land for agriculture. And even since the 90s, the number of average sprays a crop will get of pesticides, so that's anything that kills an insect, has increased by like 4 times or something ridiculous. It's an average of like 17 sprays per year your average field gets of
since
pesticides.
the 90s.
Just since the 90s.
Wow.
So since I was a kid, it's massively intensified. So if you're spraying, so let's take a field. If you're spraying a field with pesticides several times a year, herbicides to get rid of unwanted, inverted commas, weeds, and then fungicides to stop fungal infections of the plants. So the fungicides will dissolve the fungal network in the soil that trees use to communicate with each other. That'll go. And then all of the insects that would live in that field, they're all gone. Any of the weeds that would be within that field, they all die off. So all of the birds that rely on eating seeds from weeds, they disappear. So we're seeing that everywhere. Things like the turtle dove have declined by over 90% in this country. They're going to go extinct in the next decade, pretty much, if we don't change. And then all of these insectivores, so things that like flycatchers, spotted flycatchers used to be one of the most common garden birds in the country, and they've declined by, it's at least 3/4, something, again, terrifying.
I'm so surprised by these numbers and how it seems to be so close to where we are, because conservation isn't a new thing. You know, since we've been growing up, it's all been on the TV, been on the news, and it's still happening. Why is that?
People are just very detached. We live in a highly consuming society. I think we've come to expect easy to buy food at a really, really cheap price. So convenience and cost are the 2 things that people factor in. So walk into, I won't name any supermarket, and you can demand at any time of year, pineapple, avocado, beef from around the world. You know, like in the UK, we grow loads of sheep for lamb, and then we export most of our sheep and then import from New Zealand. So we'll find sheep from New Zealand. But we just want the lowest price at our convenience all the time. We don't think, hang on, should we be able to buy pineapples in December? Because no, I want a pineapple for my pina colada. So
yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
I guess there's a balance to be struck, right?
Yes.
You know,
it's about consuming less, simplifying our lives, and not wasting a lot of food, which we do. And just thinking about that impact. It's a massive, massive problem, and I often sound quite doom and gloom about it, but
I see you worked with a charity called Hill, I believe, the rewilding charity.
Yes.
That looks brilliant. They're just buying up small pieces of land and just letting it go back to nature, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. So their vision at the moment is just for England, and they will be basically adding more and more parcels as they kind of fundraise as they go along. And their idea is to buy land that's accessible by most people, so near towns and cities. And like you said, just letting nature do its thing, which is a whole new philosophy in itself. That's very controversial in conservation. There's a really good book that's based on the Nep estate called Wildlife by Isabella Tree, and that's about taking what was previous agricultural intensively farmed land and letting nature do its thing. And the wildlife that's returning to that piece of land is astounding people across the entire conservation sector. It's amazing.
Really?
So what would be the average day for you? You know, get up and what do you do?
That's a good question. I suppose there isn't one really. In my day job, I work for a conservation charity and I work in communications. So it might be communicating about nature reserves. It might be writing a blog about, you know, a new piece of policy that might affect wildlife. It might be writing a factual blog about some really cool bird behaviour. And then in my spare
time... Is the majority of it online?
Majority of it's online, but we do press and TV and radio and all sorts of things like that. All the comp stuff. And then in my spare time, it's all about just getting outside. So all of my nature knowledge is either self-taught or I've linked up with volunteers who are just the most wonderful people in the world for nature charities, and just going out and teaching myself wildlife. So finding natural spaces, just go for a walk. I don't have any fancy equipment. I've got binoculars, but you don't need expensive ones. I use my phone for most of my photography, and just go and see what I can see. And if I know what it is, then get a good photo of it. If I don't know what it is, get a good photo of it and then try and find out later and then write about it.
Yeah, there's loads of great content on your Instagram, actually. You had a look through it the last couple of weeks. You do loads of videos explaining about different species, and there's some botany on there, and there's animals and whole stories about reintroducing beavers to the country as well, which I found really interesting.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah. So, I mean, my passion with nature is from the big to the little. So seeing something awesome like beavers that have been extinct in this country since the medieval era are coming back. It's like the best thing.
Yeah.
All the way down to the tiniest, spider that I found in my bathroom the other night. It's the big and the little that does it for me.
Because I read something a while ago about reintroducing wolves to Scotland. How do you feel about that?
Well, when people say rewilding, that's the first thing that they start worrying about.
Worrying? I can't wait.
Yeah. That's the thing, yeah. I mean, people have like livelihoods and they worry that it might impact on things like, sheep farming or even, pets or whatever. Wolves, if it is ever going to happen, it's very, very far away in the UK. Rewilding isn't necessarily about those big charismatic species. The thing is when you do have a functioning ecosystem, everything keeps itself in check. And so
that's what I mean. The deer populations in the country are too high or something at the moment, and
yes,
having those big predators controls that, right? And it's better for the forests and flowers as well.
That's exactly it. It's that knock-on effect. There's been studies of wolves that have been reintroduced to Yellowstone, where before that there was areas that were completely like denuded landscapes where deer were overgrazing. And then as soon as you put wolves in, it means the deer avoid certain areas because they feel a little bit more at risk in those areas. Perhaps it's a bit more steep-sided and they think, well, if I'm here and a wolf comes, I won't be able to run away. So those areas that the deer then leave allow plants to regenerate. And then where those plants regenerate, it brings back birds that haven't been there for ages and insects and da-da-da. It's like a chain reaction. But I don't think wolves are coming anytime to the UK. There are other reintroductions that are certainly possible. So things like pine martens to England, that's happening. Beavers, like I mentioned, white-tailed eagles, absolutely colossal birds of prey.
I think I also saw a potential big cat to help control the fox population as well. And I think it may have been something like a European lynx.
Yes, there has been lynx again floated, and that again is a very contentious one. I'd say at the moment most places have got their hands full with trying to persuade people to accept beavers.
I guess the contention probably comes from the farming community, and some may say rightly so, because it is their livelihoods, and it's about striking that balance, right? If we could introduce wolves and lynxes and, say to the farmers, any losses you have will be offset by this fund or whatever, then that's the way to go about it, right? Yeah,
definitely. And it could be very cleverly done with a subsidy system. So right now, a lot of farming is very, very heavily subsidized, particularly things like sheep farming. So we're already, as taxpayers, shelling out a lot of money to farming. And if we can be smarter about it, reduce some areas of farming and subsidize people to return the land to nature, and then create subsidies for mitigation of loss if something like a lynx, if it ever happened, did take a sheep.
I think I read something about when Europe first introduced their subsidies for farming, there were certain crops that were subsidized a lot higher, and literally nearly every farmer started tearing up their fields and planting these, and then basically you just end up with one vegetable.
It's like that's the intensive, so the common agricultural policy cap, it's called, has had a lot of effects in terms of, there's some fascinating, if you want to get really nerdy about it, there's some fascinating aerial studies you can look at that show the increase in the average size of a field since something as recent as the 50s. So what used to be, if you looked at like a whole area near the village, there'd be like 20 small scale fields, all rotationally farmed on a small basis. There'd be a network of hedgerows and big old oak trees and all these physical features breaking up the landscape. And that would hold things like turtle doves, like nightingales, in the margins, you'd have things like lapwings and skylarks. But since the 50s to now, what has been 20 fields has become 2 fields. All those hedges have gone, those trees have gone. It's opened into one big desert of an empty space, and the wildlife's gone along with it. That's the effect of the policy.
Do you know the sort of statistics around whether that's been better for the farmers? Have they been able to make more money, I suppose? Or does it actually represent a gain for society and for the farmers?
No, I'd say no. What might have been any short-term gains financially for farmers and businesses, what we've got to think about is our collective future. And this isn't a blame game, because quite often in conservation it sounds like, well, we're the conservationists, you're the farmers. We're people, we buy the farmers' food, we're all in this together. It's not an us and them, it's an us umbrella. Humans as a species are doing this. and it's our collective future. And so the farming practices of yesterday and today are impacting on our future. So even if it's been profitable till now, it's not sustainable. So it does need to change.
I guess some conservation benefits farmers as well in some aspects.
Yes, it does. Yeah. So you know, you can be really clever with it, and with diversification as well. If you perhaps intensively farmed less of an area, NEP estate has shown what tourism can bring in. So ecotourism. People want to come and see this wildlife. People want to come and see these things, and you can do different experiences. But also, food is very, very cheap. It is very cheap, and that's a very contentious political topic. But as an average household now, we spend something like 11% of our income on food, whereas in the past it used to be about 40%.
Oh, wow.
So what we think of as being expensive, food, I mean, that's the main thing we need in a day, apart from water and air. Like, it should be a big kind of focus of our lives, but we kind of take it for granted a lot. You can, walk into any old fast food chain and buy a McBucket of chicken for like £3 or £4, and it's like, where's the value on that? The process that's created that. You know what I mean?
What would be some of the positive traits or personality traits, that someone would need to be in the industry?
I think there's lots. I think just passion will carry it. I mean, in the conservation sector, it's full of the most wonderful, passionate people that you'll come across. People are so invested in it, and there's a special quality of people who have the nature thing, as I call it, who see nature and see wildlife through these glasses where you can just understand it, and the passion just flows through people. So I think passion, number one. Dedication. If you want to learn your stuff, if you want to get bird knowledge, you do have to spend time, but it's kind of a chain reaction again, in that once you find that, you tick off that first bird and you're like, oh, I identified a great tit. And then you're like, oh, what's that bird? Oh, what's that? Oh, and then it just escalates, and before you know it, you're in a hide with binoculars.
What do you think that people have maybe connected with nature more since we've had this whole lockdown thing going on? I think certainly maybe our generation have become more and more aware, and are maybe looking at our lives and thinking, what can we do to help?
Massively. I think it's been insane. I mean, I've been harping on about this for years, and the number of random people from like my high school and all sorts that have got in touch with me during the last 4 months and have been like, what's this bird in my garden? Because people are sat at home, they're not commuting to work, they're not taking the kids to school, they're sat and they're just, they might be on a Zoom and staring out the window and they see something. There was a really good hashtag on the RSPB did a thing called the Breakfast Birdwatch, and if you typed in hashtag Breakfast Birdwatch on Twitter and then just added the word never, the number of posts that were like, I've lived here for 30 years and I've never seen this.
Really?
I've never seen these birds before. I never knew that I had a hedgehog in my garden. People, and people in proper lockdown, when we were only allowed out an hour a day, people were walking up new routes on their doorstep that they'd never walked on before, and finding patches of woodland and meadows and streams and all these things. And they were like, oh, this is actually
funny
nice.
You should say that. Actually, we have loads of countryside near us, and there's huge sort of river and tributary area near us. And you'd see very few people sort of walking their dogs or even just getting out there and seeing it all. And since lockdown, it's been rammed. There's
exactly
been hundreds of people over there, and you're like, where have you all come from?
Yes, it's been amazing, because I'm out there all the time anyway, being a weirdo, and the number of times I've been like lying in the mud trying to watch a kingfisher, or crawling through the undergrowth trying to film a beetle, and people have come past me all wearing like really clean clothes and white trainers, like looking very lost. I'm like, welcome, this is the outdoors, let me show you this beetle, it's great.
So what are some of the biggest positives and opportunities you've taken out of the industry? I saw you've worked on some amazing stuff for the BBC, sort of Spring Watch and Winter Watch, and it looks great.
Yeah, that's been an honour, because I'm a nerd, and that's been like my favourite programme for the history of it being on. So yeah, that was chuffed to bits to work on Spring Watch this year for the first time. What was the question? Sorry, what are the positives?
Yeah, the positives and opportunities you've taken out of the industry.
I'd say just knowledge. I'd say knowledge from the conservation sector, having worked on a few nature reserves, the number of local people that have an affinity with their nature reserve. And it is often older generation, to stereotype, but people of the older generation had completely different childhoods to us. And so there seems to be a lot more kind of hardcore naturalists in there. But the amount of time they've got to teach a younger person who's got that enthusiasm, you know, these experiences that if you weren't savvy, you'd pay a lot for, to go on like a private bird watching tour. You're looking at like 50 quid for a half day. Whereas I can write to my local nature reserve and say, hey, are you doing any surveys? And they, oh yeah, come out, we'll show you all of these birds for free. And we'll teach you about them whilst we're at it. So I'd say the knowledge and the passion of people who take the time to show you and just do stuff.
Whilst you've been working in the industry, have you seen any really positive impacts in work you've been doing? Yes, I'd say, I mean, I've worked on some amazing conservation projects that have seen amazing outcomes for wildlife. So, you know, bringing breeding birds back to a nature reserve or restoring a habitat, you know, lots of wins for nature. But I think the thing that affects me the most is the wins for people, and seeing, connecting completely new people to nature is one of the best things. You know, if somebody's never held a frog and you put that slimy little weirdo in their hands and seeing their eyes light up with like amazement, and that's magic. And that's, you know, there's a number of people that I've worked with who've been volunteers or visitors to nature reserves who've then started on a journey to become proper nature nerds and even start working in the sector themselves. And that's where it's really, really cool to see people get, you know, they get suddenly the thing that you love so much, and it's like, yeah. Yeah, no, that's really good. What about some of the less favourable aspects of the job? Oh, it's just soul destroying. Which sounds stupid. It's an unending battle, isn't it? So. Yes, I wrote about this recently on my Instagram. It's a blessing and a curse having the nature thing and working in conservation, because it's the most fascinating, wonderful, brilliant, beautiful subject in the world, and you'll never run out of things to learn about or see, and it's just mind-blowing on a daily basis. But you're also seeing it be destroyed constantly, and you're seeing all these negative effects. And when you go outside of your nature bubble and you talk to people in the real world, and you're like, whoa, people literally do not care about this. So it's like in equal parts really inspiring and really, really depressing, because it is in a really bad state. I sound like a negative Nelly, but it is not good. As Attenborough would tell you, it is not good. We like to talk a little bit about sort of incomes you could expect working within the industry. We've done some research and we've just got some average figures, and if you could say if you agree or not with these figures. So starting out, you're probably looking at maybe 18k with 10 years experience, maybe 25 to 30,000. Does that sort of fit with your knowledge of the area? Probably, yes. The sad thing is about the nature and conservation sector is nobody's in it for the money, but that's also the great thing, because there's no kind of egos in there. So you don't do it for if you want stacks of cash, might not be the sector for you, but that's what I love about it. You know, a lot of it's charity, so it's charity income. But then again, it goes hand in hand with living a more simple life. If you're reducing your consumption and living quite, you know, simply and appreciating nature is free to appreciate, that's the best thing about it, then you might not have as many outgoings. So yeah, I mean, yeah, it's definitely more than enough to live on. Okay. Yeah, you're just not going to be a millionaire. What would be something that's not in the job description that you have to deal with day to day? Ooh. I was going to suggest the mud, but I think most people, you might have to know that you have to be into that. I don't know. That's in the job description. I would say becoming the go-to bird nerd or wildlife nerd. Yeah. Okay. So, you know, like I said, people that you've not heard of from 10 years will send you, you know, a photo of half of a dead bird that their cat's brought in and ask what that is. You've got to get used to that. Oh, you like birds? You must know this. X, Y, Z. Or the best is a photo with like, there'll be a grey speck in the distance 50 meters away, and I'll be like, can you tell us what this is? No. Yeah, sure, no problem. It's just a pigeon. Yeah. What's your sort of most memorable moment working in conservation? Maybe it's something you've seen or done. Oh, crikey. Oh. Maybe the beavers. I've never seen a beaver in the wild yet, so that's yet to happen. Touch wood, pat wood. Hopefully I'll see one in October. Most memorable. I don't know. The thing is, and this is a really crap answer, sorry, but those mind-blowing, memorable moments happen on a daily or weekly basis when you're outside looking at nature. You know, like last week I saw a kingfisher. Oh, tell you what I saw yesterday. I saw a sparrowhawk.
So yesterday
yeah.
I saw a sparrowhawk ripping apart a pigeon. Excellent.
Oh my word!
I get quite a few of those around where I live, actually.
Yeah.
I have a shed down the bottom of the garden, and every now and then one sits on top of there with a pigeon,
Yes.
enjoying his lunch.
That's the thing. There's always something spectacular, and like I'll change what my favourite bird is every 20 minutes, or this week it might be all bats, and then next week I might see a really good fungus, and then the week after you see something else really cool. So it's always changing, but that's it. There's always something amazing to give you that kind of wow factor.
That's brilliant.
So how does somebody progress within the conservation space? How do you progress in it, I suppose?
So there's a very conventional route. I kind of cheated and just got a job without volunteering, which isn't really how things go. But everybody says volunteer, and that can be quite exclusive because you do need a certain amount of financial backing to do that. So if you do go to uni, I cannot enough recommend doing a sandwich year if your student loans will fund it and you can get a grant for it. So multiple organisations, the Wildlife Trust, the RSPB, do residential internships. So you can go and live on a goddamn nature reserve for 6 months or a year, and you can get trained how to do. There's internships for practical stuff, so to become a nature reserve warden. There's internships for people engagement, so how to run like a visitor site and lead guided walks and teach people about wildlife, or lead school groups and things like that. So you can do that if you go to uni and you get a sandwich year. You can do it before or after if you can fund yourself to not work for a year or on a very low pay, because some of them do bursaries. But that's not by any means accessible for most people. So what I would say is be creative. Think about what your skills are, where does your passion lie, and what are you good at, and what do you want to do? If you want to work in comms, if you want to work in graphic design, if you want to work in video production, approach these organisations off your own back, and don't be afraid to keep trying, because it might not happen straight away, but you can create your own volunteer role. People are crying out for volunteer roles, so it doesn't have to be a written opportunity that's on the internet or on a volunteer thing. You can get in touch with your local wildlife trust and be like, hey, I'm really good at editing videos. You want someone to do this for 2 hours a week? And then you can do it in the evening. You can do it around your time. So if you're working part-time, if you're at uni, and you can develop your own skills then. So I think that's definitely a win-win.
Okay, brilliant. Would you still go into the industry knowing what you know now?
Yes, I couldn't do any of the job. I couldn't. Sometimes it gets so overwhelmingly like everything's dying that I think maybe I should just go and work in a pub, but then you can't unknow what you know.
Yeah.
So no, it's the best thing in the world and the best people in the world.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on, Lucy. I've really, really enjoyed the chat.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
Thank you. Lucy, where can we find you on social media?
I'm on Instagram and Twitter under Lucy Lapwing. Dare I say it, I'm venturing into YouTube and TikTok, but we'll get there.
Well, good luck with that.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you.
It's been absolutely brilliant speaking to you. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you so much.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.